All right, so looking at our account controller and looking at our HTTP post for our login method, once we actually set up our project DB context, we go in and we grab our user based on their username and password. And if we get back that user, right now we're just simply saying, success, good login, we found a user in the database, or else invalid username or password. So what I want to do instead of just giving these blanket responses is I want to change the success good login to actually log them in. I want to be able to take that user. We're going to utilize a cookie. So we're going to generate a cookie for that user saying that they were authenticated successfully, store that cookie in their browser, and it becomes essentially like a session cookie. It says while this session is active, this cookie will persist, and then this user is actively authenticated or actively logged in. And those are the basic mechanics. And then once we have that piece in place, we can then go into other controllers and actions and actually flag whether you have to be authorized to access that space or if we're going to allow anonymous access. And those are your two modes. So to start, I'm going to clean this up a little bit. And then I will comment out this line. So the first step in actually generating that cookie is that we will take our user information and we're going to set up what's called forms authentication. And with forms authentication, you create an authentication token. And the token functionality comes out of system.web.security.forms authentication. So that's a utility class that manages forms authentication. So this utility class has a whole bunch of methods, different pieces of functionality. With ASP.NET MVC, there are certain methods within this utility that actually now throw exceptions. It used to be one line of code that worked great every time, and it was called setAuthCookie. You pass in the username, you'd pass whether or not the cookie should persist, and by persist I mean, so you come to the site, you log in. A cookie is set on your computer. When you close your browser, your session technically is terminated. If the cookie persists, that means that even after the browser is closed, all instances are closed, maybe the computer shut down, whatever the case may be, you boot back up, you open your browser, you return to the website, does the site remember who you are? From a user's perspective, that usually turns in its login box and then the remember me checkbox, right? So if you check remember me, then every time you go to Facebook or go to Twitter or go to Amazon, it remembers who you are. It doesn't prompt you for a username and password. It just knows you are who you are and it puts you right back in. That is determined by that's enabled by a persistent cookie. If the cookie doesn't persist, then once you close the browser or shut down the computer and go back, that cookie's gone and you have to log back in. So that's the determining factor. And in this case, we don't want the cookie to persist. We want it to be set, and while you're actively on the site, you're using it, but then once you've left the site, then we want it to just disappear. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So setAuthCookie no longer functions. So instead, what we have to do is we have to get an auth cookie, which takes the same parameters, but instead of just putting the cookie onto the user's browser, it gives it back to you as an object on the server side, and then we have to manually put that cookie into the browser. So get auth cookie still takes the same two parameters, username, and then whether or not we want to create a persistent cookie. So to do that, we'll take the matching user's username. The matching user is our user DTO that we got back from the database. And then we'll just say false for whether we want it to persist. Then on the left side, I'll say var cookie.
So we now have the cookie that we want to store. Then from here we can say response.cookies.add. And we just pass in that cookie.
So from within the controller, that's it. Simple as that.
On the else side of things here, I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit more functional. So instead of just spitting out some response text, what I'm going to do is do model state.add model error. And this takes two parameters. The first one is the key. I'm just going to put a blank string in there. And the second one is actually an overload. It can take an exception or another string. And in this case, I'm going to put a string in here that says bad username or password. And then here I'm going to return view. I'm going to drop this return at the bottom.
Now, since I deleted the return at the bottom, I now have to either return on this part of the if statement or this part of the if statement. So what will happen is, let's walk through it. We fill out the login form, we post back, we connect to our DB context, we try to find our user. If the user exists, we build an auth cookie, and then we store that auth. The next step should be we redirect back to either the default, the home page, or we, well, in this case, we'll just redirect back to the home page. Or we can redirect to the page that they were requesting that required authentication. Those are our two options. Else, if there's not a user found in the database, and we say bad username or password, and we return them back to the same view, the login page again, presenting that error message. That's what this else is. So we'll add another line or two in here.
And we'll use the redirect to action. And in this case, we'll return to the index of our home controller.
And we'll get into the return URL and stuff in a little bit.
Alright, so that's all we got to do within the action. The other piece that we have to do is we actually have to wire up or configure ASP.NET to use forms authentication. Because that's what we're utilizing here, but we haven't actually told ASP.NET MVC that we're doing that. So flipping back to your Solution Explorer, scroll down to the very bottom where your web config is. You want to go into that web config. You'll want to find the system.web element within your web config. That element is where you put all of the system.web or ASP.NET configuration. It'll be in a different spot depending on your project. Typically, in this case, since we're all using the same stock templates and everything, it should be kind of around line 28, 23, something like that. So what you want to do is you want to jump inside or in between the system.web elements, and we're going to add a new element called authentication. Then we're going to add an attribute to the authentication element called mode. Now there's multiple different types of authentication modes that are supported. The one we want is forms. Now, authentication has its own set of parameters. We'll want to use the forms element. And under forms, we have choices for things like cookie list, default URL, domain, lock attributes, which I won't get into those. We have the login URL, name, path, protection, require SSL, sliding expiration, and really depending on your setup and how you want authentication to be handled, you can choose to set these. The one that I'm interested in right now is the login URL. Now the login URL needs to point to where the login page is. And for us, we're going to put in ~accounts/login. Now the tilde is a notation that has actually existed since classic ASP. But what the tilde stands for when you put it inside of a URL, it is the root of the web app. So if you wanted to point to, this is, whatever your website URL is, / that tilde represents that. And ASP.NET actually parses that and then calculates what the absolute root URL is. So what we're looking for is, off of the root of the website, we're looking for the account controller / the login action. That's what we're wanting to redirect to. Okay. So we've got that piece configured. I'm going to go ahead and put the default URL in here as well. And it'll just be ~. Go to the root of the site. I'm going to break these out so they're a little easier to see. So we set up the login URL, we set up the default URL. So we'll save the web config. And then we'll jump back to our account controller. And I'm actually curious about something, so let me look here real quick. Okay, that's what I thought. So off of the forms authentication utility class, there actually is a property called default URL. So we can utilize that instead of just assuming it's the home page. So to do that, we'll make a quick modification. So instead of redirect to action, we're going to just redirect. And we'll put in that default URL in there. So what will happen is that ~/ will get returned by this property. And then we're saying redirect to ~. The parsing engine picks that up, realizes that that's the root of the site. It'll redirect us back to the root of the site. And then for us, that'll pick us up and put us back at home/index. All right, so let's F6 and build. Now, the last thing that we need to do is we need to secure something. Require us to log in before we can do anything. So to do that, I'm going to jump into my user manager controller. And I want to secure it. I want to require authentication before you can get in here. To do that, you utilize the authorize attribute. So at the top of my class, I'm going to put authorize. Now, this attribute has a set of overloads. You can just go straight by itself, or you can put in, I'm not sure what order does, I'll have to look back at the docs, but you can identify specific roles or users in this attribute. And we'll get into that in later lectures when we start talking about how you build out an admin space. You control users based on their roles and what they have access to. So by default, for now, we'll just utilize the default authorize element. So what this is doing is it's saying any action inside of this controller, you have to be authenticated in order to access. Now, what we could do is there's a sister element to this that's called allow anonymous. And I'm going to, come on. I'm going to go ahead and put that on this method and this method. And what that's saying is the user doesn't have to be logged in order to access these actions. Now I can do the same as before, and I can actually come up to the class level and say everything on the account controller is allow anonymous. So I have flexibility with these attributes. I can put it on a class, I can put it on a method. I can put it on the entire controller, or I can just put it on a single action. If you put authorize at the class level, you cannot decorate an action with allow anonymous. Because by default, the class requires authorization, and then for you to turn around and say, but this one's okay. It doesn't like that. I'm not sure why, because it makes some logical sense, but I'm sure it has to do with how they parse it. So if you have mixes of some are authorized and some are anonymous, you have to decorate each method individually. Say these are authorized and these are anonymous. You can't do it at the class level and then override. All right, so let me build. Then we'll go ahead and run. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and go /user manager. So by going to my user manager, it detected that you have to be authorized. So then it kicks me to my login page. Now you'll notice up in the URL it says that my URL is now /account/login, return URL, and then it actually has a URL encoded version of the user manager address. That was the part I was talking about before, was once you log in successfully, do you go to the default, or do you go back to where you were trying to get to, right? It would be annoying if every time you got asked to log in, it took you all the way back and then you didn't figure out how to get back to where you wanted to be. So we can accommodate for that, and I'll show you how. But it brings us to our login page. So from here, I'll log in. Let's see if I'm fast enough. Probably not. All right, so it logged me in, redirected me back to the home page. So now if I go /user manager, now I can access the user manager. Okay. So now the obvious thing is I need to be able to sign out, right? So to do that, what I'll do is I'll detect if I'm logged in, and I'll swap this sign in navigation item for a sign out. So that'll happen underneath the layout, _layout, which is in the views shared folder. And this part is actually pretty simple. It's just an if statement that we put inside of this layout. If you go back to your Solution Explorer, go under View and Shared, and then there's _layout. Find it? Yeah. So the item in question for me is the sign-in. So I'm going to go a line above it and do @if, and there's a property off of the request object, the HTTP request,
that gets is a Boolean that identifies whether or not the user is authenticated, whether they've logged in or not.
And it's actually the easiest way to check. So request dot is authenticated. And the idea is if they're logged in, we give them a sign out. If they're not signed in, we give them a sign in. So we'll say if the user is not authenticated, show this menu item. Else, I'm just going to copy this line, paste it. I'm going to show sign out. Now I need to create an action called logout to actually log them out, so we'll have to fill in the blanks there. Now we could even go one better and say sign out, and then actually present them with their username so that we can identify who is logged in. So to do that, this first string is the display text. This is what shows up for our link. So what I'm going to do is do sign out, parentheses, and then I'm going to append the username in the middle there so the username shows up in parentheses. To get access to the username, there's another pre-built piece of functionality. There's a user property off of what's called our HTTP context or our view context. So we can say user.identity.name. Now that user.identity.name is the username of the user who's currently logged in. You can also access user.identity.name from your controller. So if you wanted to do some special checking of who's logged in type of a thing from the controller side, you just use that same string, or not string, but that same user.identity.name, and it will give you back the username. And from there you can query the database, grab your user object, and then do whatever work you need to do with that user. Check roles and so forth. So we'll save that. Now you notice I didn't actually make any code changes. This is all done in the view. So now if I flip back and refresh, now it shows who's logged in, gives me the ability to sign out. We can go on our way. So we click sign out. I don't have a logout action, so it blows up. Let me flip back here. Let me go to my account controller. Let's do that. And I'll just come down here and I'll do public action result, log out. And the logout's really easy. It's the forms authentication dot sign out. And then I usually redirect back to that forms authentication default. Or we can actually redirect to forms authentication login. So they logged out, log them back in, right? So we'll F6 that. Forgot my return. Alright, so rebuild. So now if I click sign out, it'll take a second, it's got to recompile everything. So that log this out, and now gives us an option to sign in, brings us back to our sign in page. Okay? Any questions around that? All right. So the only last piece I do want to show you real fast is how do we handle that return URL? Right? It would be ideal that we try to get to the user manager. It says, hang on, you gotta log in. We log in, and then it goes ahead and takes us back to, or takes us to the user manager. So to do that, we go back to our HTTP post for our login. And I've seen a lot of different approaches to this. It's your own discretion as to how you want to do it. Some people will come up here in the login and they'll do comma, string, return, URL. And that basically becomes a parameter. You can say if, and on the string type, string is also a class. It has some statics. There is an is null or white space. So if the return URL is null or white space, use the default. Does that make sense? So if there's no return URL provided, redirect to the default. Else, redirect to the return URL. So F6 that to rebuild, flip back. I'll just reload the page for making sure I'm current and synced up. So now when I log in, that's the wrong one. Hit submit. It redirects me straight to the user manager.
How did it get that?
What is that it got?
The redirect URL. Like you just added the parameter and then it like magically
Yes.
got it.
Yes. Yeah, I added return URL as a parameter. And the model binder, so if you remember, like when a form's filled out and we post back, we're posting back information, right? Each one of our text boxes has a name, and those names match up with our new model, and all that happens. What also happens is that besides looking at that post back data, the form data, it actually looks at all of the query string parameters that come along for the ride as well. And in this case, return URL is a query string parameter. Question mark, return URL equals.
So it's because it's named the return URL into it.
Yes.
So if you named something else, you would have to.
Yeah, if I called it cheesecake, it wouldn't have picked up the value and put it into the function.
So how would you do it if you didn't name the return URL?
If you didn't name it return URL, well, you would have to.
You have to name it return URL.
Yes. Yeah, in order for it to do the model binding. So the other option, the name still matters. Either way, you have to make sure that you know the name of it. Let me say that first. Okay? It's not that it's going to pick something random and then you do something with it. You have to know what that name is.
The name of
Of the query string parameter. Oh, not that one. You have to know what this is.
okay.
You have to know. Like, you as the developer are responsible for understanding that, knowing that that's what it is, and then process it. That you don't have to use the parameter on the action, where I did comma string return URL. You can do it another way if you want. I don't know if you want me to get into it and confuse you.
No, I think I get it now. It's just, where did you name it return URL, or is that just what it's?
That's what ASP.NET does on that.
Okay.
It identifies that you're trying to go to a page that's authorized and you're not authenticated. It redirects you to the login URL, which is this, and then it, as a help, puts the return URL in there for you. Does that make sense? So, what you're probably thinking is there a way to do it programmatically without having to know that it's called return URL?
Yeah, and like relying on the
String
ASP.
always be. Yes.
I think there is a function that may pull it, but it was never consistent. This get redirect URL function off of forms authentication, I've tried using it in the past, and I get mixed results. Sometimes it throws an exception because of the same reason you can't use set off cookie, and sometimes it works. It depends on
the server you're running it on, the runtime you're using, a lot of factors.
So this is the better way.
This is the way that I've, at least it's worked consistently. I haven't run into runtime issues. Ironically, this requires you to still pass in the username in that cookie persistence check. And I think that was my problem, is when I run this, internally it tries to do the set off cookie. Because that's why it asks you for the username and all that, is it tries to set the off cookie and then give you back the URL. So instead I said, screw that, I'll do it my own way, and then I just grab the return URL directly. If you wanted to make it more dynamic, let's say, instead of doing this, you can take the string and store it in your web config, whatever the name is, and then you can extract that at runtime, and then there's a way to pull out query string. I can show you if you want to see it.